How's it going, everybody? So this video is going to be a restoration of this 1942 Delta 14-inch bandsaw. What makes this bandsaw special is two things. Right there you can see that cast iron base, that Art Deco style. I've been looking for one of these for about 3 years now, and I'm super excited to finally find one and be able to do this restoration. The second part that makes this thing special is it has an oil-bathed transmission. And what this allows you to do is shift a gear, and that's to slow the blade speed down so you can cut metal. So hopefully you guys enjoy the video, and let's get started. So the first thing that I do when I'm doing one of these restorations is I tear this whole thing completely down. Take every bolt, nut, washer off. And what I'm doing with those is I'm taking them off, I'm putting them in little Ziploc baggies, and then I take a Sharpie and I write on that baggie what they go to. So the 6 bolts that hold the trunnion assembly for the table, I put those all in one little bag and say trunnion assembly for the table. The reason I do this is because until I get in here, I don't know what parts I need. And if I need to order bearings, sometimes it can take up to a month to get the bearings for these saws because they're pretty specialized. And when you come back a month later to put something together, you may not know what bolts went where. You'll eventually figure it out, but it's just a huge time saver if everything is marked in a nice little bag. You can just grab it and know, hey, this is what went to the table, and you're not having to play the guessing game. Generally, whenever I do a rebuild on one of these saws, I'm replacing 6 bearings. 2 bearings in the upper pulley and 2 bearings in the lower pulley that the blade rides on. And then there's 2 thrust bearings that go in the top and bottom blade guides. Those are pretty much all the bearings that you'll see in these saws. There are bearings that are in that transmission, but that transmission is 1, oil bathed, and 2, if it's older style transmission, it is completely enclosed and protected from the elements. So there shouldn't be much moisture getting in there. And depending on the application the saw was used upon before you got it, you will normally not see too much wear in there because a lot of times these saws were just used as wood cutting, and so they never even really engaged the transmission. So there's not usually a whole lot of wear that you'll find in those transmission bearings. So you can see right here, I've popped out the transmission case. I'm getting in there, cleaning it out. And the reason I use the rags is, one, I can't get all the oil out just because of the curvature of the casting. And 2, there's sometimes a lot of sludge in there. So we're going to pop our camera in here, and you can see it's pretty clean. There wasn't a lot of sludge in here. I don't think this thing really ever was engaged, so you're not going to get the grime buildup that comes when you're running that saw in metal cutting mode. Here I am taking apart the base, and what it is 4 cast iron panels and I think 4 cross members that hold everything together, and it's all bolted together. Pretty straightforward to take apart, and this is where it really shines, to just put all those little nuts and bolts in plastic bags so you remember where they go when it comes time to put this back together. This is the bottom blade guard right here, and you can see the holes there were from the previous owner who had bolted a table for just storing little odds and ends on it. And I want to get the saw back to as original of a condition as I can. So the way I went about doing that is ground everything down, and you can see I'm just going over there really slowly, tack welding this in, and using very low heat settings so I'm not warping that sheet metal. Once I get it all filled in with weld, and then I go back over, I had to take my angle grinder here, and I'm just feathering it. I'm not going super fast, I'm just taking my time, getting that weld off, trying to blend everything in, and the idea is try to make this look as original as possible. I really try to stay away from doing major modifications on very classic machinery like this. I think past the 50s and earlier is classic machinery because you take away from the value of it. Obviously, this is really the only way to do this right. I didn't want to bondo it or do anything else. I think, welding the holes back together is perfectly acceptable in this case. But just be careful if you're getting into really old machinery. Try to really think if that modification you're about to do that's going to be permanent is going to take away from the value of it. I kind of pride myself on trying to make these things look as original as possible, and it's just kind of my 2 cents on the subject right there. Here I am going over the cast iron base, and these things have a lot of nooks and crannies, a lot of corners, and it's a lot of sanding. One thing I would really stress when you're doing any of these old vintage machinery like this is be very careful about the dust that you're producing. So guarantee this thing has lead base paint on it. It's from the 40s, and you gotta be really careful about what you're doing. I'm using my vacuum cleaner there just to get up the little dust because I don't want to just blow it off into my driveway, because If you have kids around, you don't want them getting into the contaminated dust, and it's just not healthy. So wear a mask, and don't be afraid to use a vacuum cleaner and vacuum it up as you're going, just to get that dust away from you. But also too, when you go to empty that vacuum cleaner, you may just think, oh, it's just full of dirt and grime. And you know how if it's a shop vac, you just dump it into the trash and get that little poof of dust. Well, you just also made a big old cloud of lead-based paint too. So be cautious along the whole process of doing this, because you don't want to give yourself exposure to this, and you don't want to expose anyone else that may live in the household with you. So just be smart about it. Ideally, if I really wanted to do this right, I would have taken it to a professional sandblaster who can mitigate lead-based paint. I found that I can get pretty good results of just scuffing up the paint. I'm not removing it completely, and painting it by hand. Here you can see my makeshift drying rack, and anytime I spray paint parts, I try to let it sit for at least 48 hours, 72 hours best, because it allows that paint to really harden up, and when you reassemble it, you're not as likely to scratch or chip the paint. I use Rust-Oleum charcoal gray for this project, and here you can see I'm just putting the base back together, and it's kind of tedious, lots of nuts and bolts, but it's pretty self-intuitive. So I figured I'd show you guys the motor before I install it. I've wired this so I have power coming into it. I got a nice long extension cord. Braided wire, this would be going to the retirement light. And then this wire right here, this takes power to the switch. So that's the original switch for this. And something really fascinating I found about this is a Westinghouse motor. I have this little sticker right there. Manufactured for the Delta Manufacturing Company by Westinghouse. So this is the original motor. I'm guessing this is a 1942 era. Probably came with that saw from the factory. So I'm going to scoot in there and get you a good picture of the information plate. But the motor's been rebuilt. They had the rewound a couple years ago. So I didn't break into it because it's running really smooth, and I'm not going to fix what's not broken. I know I've mentioned it in other videos, but that overhead hoist there that I'm using to lift the motor into place is a complete back saver. If you have the room for one of these in your shop and you're doing a lot of heavy lifting like this, highly recommend getting it. It is worth its weight in gold. When putting bearings on the main drive shaft, I always start with one of them outside of the machine, and they're press fit, so tap one on, and then I freeze the whole assembly. This way it will shrink it down just a couple thousandths, so when I go to put it through the machine and install that second bearing, it will be easier to slide that second bearing on. These saws originally came with felt gaskets to keep the oil in the machine. Right here I'm using Gasket Maker. It's a high temperature petroleum rated gasket maker, and you can see right there I'm adding the oil as I go to put the whole assembly in. The reason I'm doing that is because the fill port for these saws is super small and it takes forever to fill them up. So if I can just add a bunch of oil there, then I'll top it off the rest of the way through that fill port. This is arguably the most fun part of the process because you're getting to see this thing come together, get assembled, and see it really come to life. Right there I'm adding on a 6-inch riser block. This allows for doing resawing and just cutting taller material. And then there again, having that overhead hoist there Just makes easy work of getting that thing moved over and held in place so it doesn't fall on me when I'm trying to bolt it down to the base. That belt guard that I'm installing right there is actually made out of cast iron. I did not realize this was a thing until I got this saw. All the other saws I've done up until this point, the belt guards were made out of stamped steel. So I thought that was a pretty cool touch. As far as where to find a saw like this to do your own restoration, to have in your own shop, I find the vast majority of them are on Craigslist. OfferUp and Facebook Marketplace occasionally has them, but Craigslist is kind of my number one go-to. As far as how often they pop up on there, it just depends on what area you live in and what area you're searching in. And I've been looking for a saw like this for several years, and I had to drive well over 100 miles to get this one. So if you're willing to drive and just keep looking, you will find them. They do pop up. As far as price on a saw like this, today you're probably, it also depends on where you live, so keep that in mind too, but today you're probably going to be anywhere from $500 to $1,000 for a saw like this. Now that sounds expensive, but go down to any like saw dealer and look like a Jet or a Laguna, and they're going to be upwards of $1,000. This thing brand new when it came out of the factory in 1942 was $148, the way you see it now. Add some inflation in on that, and now that number goes up to $2,483. So this saw back then was the equivalent of a $2,500 saw today. So the quality is unmatched, and they just look awesome, and you're saving a piece of history. If you can get one of these saws, take your time, strip it down, rebuild it, do it right, this saw will last you a lifetime, and they are so awesome to look at. So what you saw in that last clip there of me using an angle grinder, what I had on that was a easy strip nylon disc for removing paint, oxidation, and rust. And the reason you use that instead of a wire wheel is it is less likely to gouge out the cast iron and cause divots in there. You want to be very careful on what you use on that because you can cause deep scratches and damage to it if you're not careful. How's it going, everybody? I have come to a stopping point with this rebuild here, and I figured I would put these two saws side by side before this one goes down the road so I could show you the differences in the two. So quick recap, these are both metal and wood cutting bandsaws, and this is a 1951, this is a 1942. There's really three differences between them. The first one being the size of the oil fill hole. So this one is about a 1/2 inch hole that runs in to where you add oil to the crankcase. Makes it pretty easy because, as you know, gear oil is really thick and it takes forever to go through small passageways. This one, maybe a 1/4 inch diameter tube, and it takes forever to fill. That's why in the video you saw me filling the crankcase before I put the cover on it and bolted it down. I just didn't want to spend all day filling it through that small hole there. Second difference with these two saws is going to be the drive wheels here. So both the top and the bottom here of this older saw are made out of cast steel. So a lot heavier weight compared to this one. The reason they went to aluminum, and this is just my guess, is to save weight. The reason that weight matters in the wheels here is the more rotating mass that you're having to spin, the more power it is sucking away from that engine and less power you have to cut whatever material you're cutting. And then obviously the third difference here is in the 40s they had the 3 bars going down on the Delta emblem, and then on the 50s you had the Delta Milwaukee. So that's the big difference right there. Just those three. As far as what I did to this saw, like parts I've exchanged off of this one, this is an aftermarket Carter, I believe it's a Carter blade guide, so it's all ball bearing. It's a really nice setup. I put on this one here because I want to keep the original Delta blade guard here. And the other difference is this has the original spindle mount that raises and lowers the wheel here. This one's kind of it's kind of melted into the grooves here, if you will, where it did not want to fit in here really well. So I just kept the modified one that the previous owner had modified, and so these have their original spindle mounts here. Other than that, this thing is 100% original, how it would have been from the factory. And that's kind of my goal with these restorations, is I like to keep things as time period specific as possible. So yeah, that's what these things look like side by side, and that's the differences. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully these videos I put out inspire you to get out there and do a restoration of your own. If you have a rusty old machine laying around, don't be afraid to dig into it. They're bulletproof. The old stuff that was built back in the day, it's relatively a simple design on pretty much anything you're going to find out there. So it's pretty easy just to take it apart, clean it up, paint it, put it back together. Maybe you have to throw in some bearings. But the stuff's all really straightforward, and it's just a joy to rebuild. And now I have a saw here that will hopefully, outlive me. That's been my goal is, I'll be 90 years old and have this saw that, I rebuilt, 60 years ago. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you like the videos, and yeah, get out there and do some restorations of your own.